It all started quietly. A few ships rerouting, insurance costs inching up, and whispers of unrest in the Red Sea. But soon the headlines grew louder: attacks, delays, and surging prices. This is the story of how one of the world's most vital waterways became an economic fault line. Welcome back to season 3 of Economically Speaking, the official podcast of the Economic Association of Sri Venkateswara College. I'm Abinaya, and in this episode, we turn our attention into an issue that's been reshaping the global trade and energy dynamics, the Red Sea crisis. We are honored to have with us Dr. Krishnan, retired IAS officer and former IEPF chair professor of economics at the National Council of Applied Economic Research, New Delhi. With nearly 4 decades of distinguished service, Dr. Krishnan has held key roles across the ministries of finance, economic affairs, rural development, and skill development. He also played a vital role in shaping India's financial sector reforms, including his work with the Financial Sector Legislative Reforms Commission, which laid the groundwork for major initiatives like inflation targeting and bankruptcy law reforms. He presently holds an independent directorship in some of the well known companies in India. His deep understanding of global and domestic economic dynamics makes him the perfect voice to help us unpack the economic implications of the Red Sea crisis. Thank you so much for joining us today, sir. We are elated to have you on board.
Thank you. Thanks, Abinaya.
To break it down simply for the audience before we dive into the economic aspects, the Red Sea is a sea inlet of the Indian Ocean lying between Africa and Asia. So, since its opening in 1869, the Suez Canal, which links the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea, has served as the backbone of trade along this route. It has drastically reduced the distance between Europe and Asia and has cut down around 7,000 kilometers. So today, this canal alone is responsible for around 10% of the world's seaborne oil and nearly 8% of the global LPG trade, which means it's very safe to assume that even the slightest of disruptions can cause major economic downfalls. So the question arises: what kind of economic vulnerabilities does the over reliance of Red Sea expose to us?
Thanks again, Abinaya, for that very generous introduction. It's a pleasure to be a part of this conversation. Focusing on what you just now said, which is the Red Sea Suez Canal route. Clearly, starting from an Indian point of view, an Asian point of view, and then moving to the globe, this is the shortest maritime link between Asia and Europe. You've mentioned some numbers, closer to sort of, yeah, and closer to our country. It's a very large proportion of our merchandise trade. If I remember right, it's close to 80% of our merchandise trade with Europe, North America, and parts of Africa actually traverses this corridor. So this area is critically important for us. Plus, it is globally important. And given whatever is happening there in terms of the attacks and effectively sort of making it a less certain route than it was, has enormous costs. Essentially, these will, fall into three buckets, in my opinion. A, huge increase in freight and insurance costs, something that you alluded to. But I think more important is the serious disruption in supply chains that this will cause and the consequential inflationary pressures. These are the three immediate economic fallout of the crisis, in and around the Red Sea. And depending on your interest, we can spend a little time discussing each of these.
Thank you so much for your answer, sir. Sir, despite this heavy economic dependence on the Red Sea has always been prone to some kind of turbulence, be it the Suez crisis of 1956 or the Arab Israeli crisis or the increased piracy attacks in the early 2000s. How has the aftershocks of this Houthi attacks been different on Red Sea? Is it because of the increased globalization, or how is the world changing right now?
Yeah, clearly a part of the answer is what you said. We are, notwithstanding what's going on in parts of the world today, we are a much more globalized world than we were, say, 50 years ago. There are pieces of data to show that globalization close to a 1 century plus, maybe early 1900s, just pre World War One, levels of globalization were probably quite high. But then there was a long period when the interconnectedness of the world declined. And post World War II, and much more post the 1960s, globalization picked up enormously. Now, given that there is such a large exchange of goods and services across the world, anything that disrupts this or creates uncertainty, for instance, in the supply chain, is a greater shock than it was earlier. And I think it's useful to, step back here and understand why globalization got a fillip post the Second World War. And a part of the answer to the crisis also, I think, lies in that development. My understanding, one of the most important developments post Second World War is, it's not immediate, spread over a decade or two, is the development of a rules based international global order, particularly a rules based international economic order. The rise of WTO, the importance of the global institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, the consequence of the rise of these institutions was the provision of what one would call, in economic jargon, global public goods. This critical factor is, I think, the most important cause for the increased connectedness of the globe. Depending on time, at some point I'd like to elaborate on this because this is also the way forward in terms of how the world will have to solve the Red Sea crisis, in my opinion.
Thank you for your answer, sir. Sir, since we discuss about the interconnectedness of the world right now, do you think there are better alternatives right now? Let's say the India Middle East Economic Corridor, or there's been increased FDI around the Cape of Good Hope. Do you think these lines could serve as an alternative, or is it just a temporary solution for Israel?
In my personal opinion, the first of these, namely the corridor that India is pushing in the area, that could potentially be a more medium term, longer term solution. But getting that off the ground also requires better and sort of more peaceful conditions and stability in this very area because we have to get this off the ground. But going around the Cape of Good Hope will be an expensive alternative. And I think it's a good segue to talk about why we need to focus on the most cost effective solution, namely getting the Red Sea route right. And I think there the answer is somewhat similar to what you learn in your uh, microeconomics sort of early lessons. Namely, markets can provide a bulk of goods and services. Efficient markets, by definition, will typically handle a bulk of society's economic issues. Given limited means and unlimited wants, this prioritization of what needs to be produced, the price mechanism handles. But if you recall your lessons, when does it fail? It fails when it comes to provision of public goods or when there are externalities. Now, You need a state, therefore, to produce a public good called law and order. You need the state and state intervention to produce something called peace, enforcement of contract, sanctity of rule of law. Now, if this is true of a country, by definition, this is true of the globe, except that there is no global sovereign who can impose his or her will on the sovereign. The good thing that happened post World War II is there was a broad consensus that we need to solve these global problems collectively. That's the whole concept of public goods and externalities. You can't solve these. An individual economic agent cannot solve it because of a whole bunch of standard, economic issues that I don't need to go into with you. So, given that phenomenon, you need an external imposition of rules of the game. What we achieved post World War II was an international rules based economic order. Was that the best solution? Was that a perfect solution? No, it wasn't. But it was a huge improvement over what existed prior thereto. Though in today's world, given what the US is doing, what China is doing, it may sound odd. There is actually no escaping this. And I think as a country which has a lot of gains potentially, India should invest a lot more in arguing for a rules based international economic order where matters like the Red Sea issues can be settled.
Thank you, sir. Sir, do you also think this issue has been affecting the developed countries and the developing countries differently, mainly the export-oriented countries? Or do you think everybody is equally affected due to this?
Clearly the answer in a mathematical sense will depend on the proportion of your external connectedness to GDP. For instance, the total exports and imports as a percentage of GDP. If you are an externally hugely connected economy, clearly a huge increase in freight costs and disruptions in supply chains affect you a lot more than others. But I think beyond that, developing countries, by definition, have less ability to absorb shocks. A standard feature of being an underdeveloped or a developing economy is that your risk mitigation institutions, your ability to absorb shocks is that much less. Your resilience is that much less. So clearly, it will affect countries unequally, and developing countries, and especially developing countries which are beginning to be far more externally oriented than before, will be disproportionately affected. And I believe we are broadly in that category because India is a relative newcomer. We began to sort of get back to international connectedness post 91. And it's a continuing, it's not a 1 day, 1 year affair. It's a decade long, multiple decade long effort. So I think it comes at a particularly bad time for countries like us, and which makes us much more vulnerable.
So, when we discuss economics, it also becomes a little bit important to look at the micro perspective. So, what, according to you, are the worst hit industries, and what industries are will probably recover, and which industries are going to suffer in the long term due to the crisis?
As I mentioned earlier, uh, close to 80% of merchandise trade of India towards North America, Europe, Africa go through this. And typically, a lot of the goods that travel by sea are the low margin goods. And, there'll be bulky low margin goods like textiles, agriculture, and they also happen to be typically far more labor intensive. So this is one of those very sad economic phenomenon where the most vulnerable will be the hardest hit. So it's going to be labor intensive industries like textiles, like agriculture, which will get hit. And on top of this, we'll have a tariff problem, which is also going to hit similar or the same set of industries. So I think the medium term, relative long term, relative medium term, early long term effects of these are going to be very, very severe on these very vulnerable, low margin, labor intensive industries.
Okay, sir. Sir, since we also talk about India, what could probably be the best solution for India to save its merchandise industry, since 80% of our trade to Europe depends on this route? How could India cope up with this
So
issue?
I think India needs to actually quote the old Chinese proverb, walk on two legs. We need a short-term solution. We need a medium-term, long-term solution. Short term, finally India has also begun to sort of look at it as a security issue. Our navy has become a little more active. In parallel, I think we need to do whatever we can to use unconventional channels of diplomacy, because when finally in this current external environment, it almost looks like each one to himself. And if that is the case, India needs to reach out to the rebels, the Houthi rebels, or whatever they are called, and their handlers and their supporters to figure out a solution to A, let Indian ships go through. You will still have problems. And a part of the answer will therefore need to come from working with our insurance industry. The medium longer term solution is to work with international agencies on what I mentioned earlier, the newer rules based international economic order, as well as on developing what we announced post G20, that new trade route. I think those are the more medium term solutions.
Okay, so how is the solution going to look like in the long term globally? Do you think it's more cost effective to approach the military protection route, or do you think it's better to invest in alternative corridors? And also, could you please throw some light on the issue that you brought up earlier, how countries, integrated together post World War II? Do you think that should happen again?
I think the longer term solution is neither military nor alternatives. It is to go back to the drawing board, sit with people, rediscover the art of negotiations, and by definition, international order means surrender of bits of sovereignty. It is the same domestically. When we allow the state to enforce a certain set of laws against you, me, and other citizens, we are surrendering a bit of our freedom. And for what purpose? We are surrendering a bit of our freedom, respectively, for the common cause of a peaceful, stable social order. There is an exact parallel globally. Countries will need to surrender bits of their sovereignty. That's how we achieved WTO. That's how we achieved. For instance, when we gave surveillance functions to the International Monetary Fund, effectively we let an international organization come back and tell us your currency is overvalued or undervalued and you need to correct it. So, in that sense, we agree to surrender a bit of our sovereignty. For what purpose? For an agreed global common good. There is no escape from that approach in the long
Okay. So, do you also think this repeated incidents of crisis in the Red Sea could probably lead to some sort of deglobalization, or do you think this won't be a long-term issue and will recover?
No, I think you're right. Your fears are right. I think in the short term, the natural tendency of countries would be to de-risk themselves because uh, domestic politics will also force leaders to not be seen as quote unquote succumbing to unreasonable pressures of other countries. So you see it in India. Uh, our leaders have been talking about much more Swadeshi, uh, which is given that India's percentage, for instance, of world trade is abysmally low, and it's actually lower today than it was a century ago. Given that we actually should be more connected with the rest of the world, given that exports are a blessing for a variety of reasons, including making you much more competitive, much more capable for a global market. A country like India should actually be looking at greater globalization, not at lesser globalization. But the politics of it will drive us in the short term towards exactly the fears that you mentioned. It will take a very enlightened political leadership to fight that tendency and to be able to sort of not put long term interests in jeopardy for short term gains. But I think that's a fear that you expressed is a possibility. In the medium and long term, I am reasonably certain that this will be a blip and we will get back to that unbroken path towards greater globalization. To sort of sum it all up, I think we need to remember that unlike a lot of the rest of the world, we chose a path of economic development in the early 50s, which did not turn out to be very successful. We made massive corrections, and given that we are a democracy, our Titanic is very slow to move, and that's the way it should be. A large democratic country cannot switch things overnight. So we began this process in 91, where we have much greater role for markets and also much greater effort at integrating with the rest of the world. So, given that we are quote unquote relative late comers to this game, it is important for us to focus on India, parallelly, also focus and persuade the rest of the world that they should not steer away from something which has been the backbone of this wonderful bout of prosperity which began post World War II. So it's in our interest and it's in the interest of the globe that we recapture what we did post World War II. And I think India should take a serious leadership position in not only advocating this as a policy for itself, but it's also a policy for the rest of the world. And all I will say is go back to our own Vedic sort of teachings on this. Long ago, much before the rest of the world discovered this, we had known about Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. The whole world is one. And I think we need to become serious evangelizers of this mantra.
Thank you so much, sir. That sums up pretty much our doubts about the Red Sea crisis. And that's it for our first episode of Economically Speaking. Thank you so much for joining us once again, sir. This is Abinaya signing off.
Thank you, Abhinaya.